They hung her father from a tree to make an example. And the only person powerful enough to stop what came next was the last man on earth anyone would beg for mercy, the Mafia boss. And by the time the little girl reached him, it was already almost too late. The black sedan rolled into the village square just after dusk, its tires crunching slowly over gravel, as if the car itself understood where it was entering. And conversations died mid-sentence the way flames suffocate when starved of air, because everyone recognized the vehicle and what it meant. Don Salvatore Rizzo had arrived. He stepped out with the unhurried grace of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush, his tailored coat immaculate, silver hair combed back, eyes sharp and observant as they swept across the square, cataloging fear the way other men counted coins, his presence bending the atmosphere around him until even the church bell seemed to hesitate before ringing the hour. Two men flanked him, silent, armed, their hands resting just close enough to their jackets to remind the village that violence was never far away, and Don Salvatore was about to continue toward the mayor's house when a sudden movement cut through the stillness like a knife. A small figure broke from the crowd. Bare feet slapped against the dirt. Someone gasped. One of his men shifted forward instinctively, but the child was already there, colliding with Don Salvatore's legs and clinging to the hem of his coat with desperate fingers. Her grip so tight, it wrinkled the expensive fabric. "Please," she cried, her voice hoarse and panicked, tears streaking paths through the grime on her face. "Please help him." The square froze. Don Salvatore looked down slowly, not startled, not angry, simply curious, the way a man might regard an unexpected card drawn from a deck. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dress was torn, one sleeve hanging loose. Her hair knotted as if she'd been running for miles, and when she lifted her face to him, there was terror there. Yes, but also something else. Defiance, raw and untrained, the kind that only children possessed before the world taught them when to bow. "They hung my daddy," she sobbed, her words tumbling over each other. "On the oak tree by the fields. He's still alive, I think. Please, mister. Please." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, heads turning instinctively toward the distant fields where the old oak stood like a dark silhouette against the fading light, and Don Salvatore's men stiffened, because everyone knew whose tree that was, and everyone knew who controlled that land. Don Salvatore raised one finger, not to threaten, not to command violence, but simply to silence the crowd, and it worked instantly. He knelt down slowly until he was eye level with the child, the square so quiet now that the sound of her uneven breathing seemed thunderous. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, terrifying in its restraint. The girl swallowed hard. "The Bracco men," she whispered. "They said my daddy stole from them. But he didn't. He didn't steal. He just told them no." That word lingered between them like a gunshot. "No." Don Salvatore's eyes flickered, not with surprise, but with recognition, because in his world, men didn't die for stealing nearly as often as they died for refusing. "Why did he say no?" Don Salvatore asked. The girl's hands tightened on his coat. "Because they wanted to use our workshop," she said, her voice trembling. "They wanted to hide things there. Bad things. And my daddy said I sleep there sometimes. He said no one was bringing bad things near me." For the first time since stepping out of the car, Don Salvatore's expression changed, just slightly, a tightening at the jaw, a shadow crossing his eyes that those closest to him recognized immediately and silently stepped back from. He stood, towering over the child now, and glanced toward his right-hand man. "Bring the car around," he said quietly, "and get the doctor." Then he looked back down at the girl. "Can you take me to him?" She nodded frantically, already pulling at his hand as if afraid he might disappear if she let go, and Don Salvatore allowed it, allowed the whispers to spread like wildfire through the square as the Mafia boss walked away hand in hand with a barefoot child, toward the fields where a man was hanging between life and death, because everyone there understood something irreversible had just been set in motion. As they drove toward the oak tree, the girl pressed her forehead against the window, pointing shakily through the glass, and Don Salvatore watched the landscape slide past with the distant focus of a man already calculating consequences, already rearranging pieces on a board only he could see. And when the car finally stopped and the oak loomed above them, its thick branches stretching outward like grasping arms, The smell of blood and damp rope hit them before they even stepped out. The father hung there exactly as Sheet said, feet barely touching the ground, face swollen, eyes half open, chest shuddering with shallow breaths that sounded more like surrender than survival. And Don Salvatore didn't hesitate. "Cut him down," he ordered. Knives flashed. The rope snapped free. The man collapsed into the dirt, coughing violently as his daughter rushed to his side, sobbing his name over and over like a prayer. And Don Salvatore crouched beside them, studying the carpenter's hands, the scars, the ingrained sawdust beneath his nails, the unmistakable marks of an honest man who worked with wood, not weapons. "You didn't steal," Don Salvatore said, not as a question. The man shook his head weakly. "I just said no," he rasped. And they said no wasn't an answer. Don Salvatore stood slowly, eyes lifting toward the horizon where the sun had nearly vanished, bathing the fields in blood-colored light. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Sometimes no is the only answer. And as his men loaded the injured father into the car, and the little girl climbed in beside him, clutching his hand like an anchor, Don Salvatore turned his gaze back toward the village, toward the unseen men who thought fear made them powerful, and made a decision that would erase an entire crew by morning. Not out of mercy, not out of kindness, but because there were rules even monsters followed. And harming a man for protecting his child was once in the underworld never forgave. By the time night fully settled over the countryside, the story of what happened at the oak tree had already begun to mutate, whispered from house to house, reshaped by fear and imagination. Because when Don Salvatore Rizzo intervened personally, it never ended with just one man being saved. The injured carpenter lay unconscious in the back room of a private clinic miles away, a doctor working quietly under armed watch, while his daughter sat on a leather couch far too big for her small frame, clutching a porcelain cup of warm milk she hadn't touched, her eyes fixed on the doorway, as if afraid her father might vanish again the moment she looked away. Don Salvatore stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the headlights of passing cars cut through the darkness below, his reflection faint in the glass, a man caught between two worlds, the protector he pretended not to be, and the executioner everyone knew him as. "The Bracco crew is denying it," Dom, his consigliera, said calmly from behind him, flipping through messages on his phone. "They're saying it was a misunderstanding, that the man was punished by freelancers acting without permission." Don Salvatore let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if there were humor left in him. "They strung a man up like an animal on land they don't control," he said. "And they did it to scare a child." He turned slowly, his gaze sharp enough to make Dom straighten without realizing it. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a declaration." Outside, engines idled as his men arrived one by one, summoned without explanation, because no explanation was needed. Everyone felt it. The balance had shifted. The Bracco family had always pushed boundaries, expanding too quickly, forgetting that power only existed as long as the right people tolerated it. And now they'd made the fatal mistake of reminding Don Salvatore why fear still had its uses. "Where's Marco Bracco?" Don Salvatore asked. Dom didn't hesitate. "At the warehouse by the river, hosting a card game." "Confident?" Don Salvatore nodded once. "Good. I don't like chasing men who think they're already dead." He glanced toward the couch, where the girl sat quietly now, her feet dangling above the floor. She noticed him looking and stiffened, as if bracing herself for bad news. Don Salvatore walked over and knelt again, lowering himself into her world, where ceilings were higher and danger came without warning. "Your father is strong," he said gently. "He's going to live." Her shoulders sagged with relief, so intense it looked painful, tears spilling freely as she nodded, pressing her sleeve to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Don Salvatore hesitated, then did something none of his men expected. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small silver coin, worn smooth with age. "Keep this," he said. "It belonged to my father. It's good for courage." She wrapped her fingers around it like it was a shield. When he stood again, the softness vanished from his face as if it had never been there. "Take her somewhere safe," he told Marco's counterpart, another Marco, taller, colder. "If anyone asks, she doesn't exist tonight." The drive to the river was silent. No music, no unnecessary words. Just the low hum of engines and the steady breathing of men who knew violence the way surgeons knew anatomy. The warehouse lights were on when they arrived, laughter spilling faintly through cracked windows, the sound of cards slapping wood and glasses clinking. And Marco Bracco was in the middle of a joke when the door swung open without warning. The laughter died instantly. Everyone in the room stood at once, hands hovering, unsure whether to reach for weapons or raise them in surrender, because Don Salvatore Rizzo did not arrive unannounced unless he intended to leave fewer people behind. Marco Bracco forced a smile, spreading his hands. "Salvatore," he said, voice too loud, too practiced. "You should have called Don." Salvatore walked in slowly, his footsteps echoing against the concrete, eyes scanning the room, counting men, exits, options. "I did," he said quietly. "You just didn't answer." He stopped in front of the table and placed something down with deliberate care. A coil of rope, still stained, still damp. The room seemed to shrink. Marco's smile faltered. "You see," Don Salvatore continued, his voice calm enough to be mistaken for mercy, "there are rules. Even between men like us. Territory, permission, proportion." He leaned forward slightly. "Explain to me how hanging a carpenter on my land fits into any of those." Marco swallowed. "He disrespected us," he said quickly. "Refused cooperation. We had to send a message." Don Salvatore nodded slowly. "You did send a message," he agreed. "Just not the one you thought." He straightened, eyes hard now. "You told me you're careless. You told me you're desperate. And worst of all, you told me you're willing to frighten children to feel powerful." Marco laughed nervously. "Come on." It was business. The word business landed wrong, echoing unpleasantly. Don Salvatore gestured once, barely noticeable, and two of his men moved instantly, grabbing Marco by the arms and forcing him to his knees. The room erupted into chaos, shouting, scrambling, guns half drawn. But Don Salvatore raised his hand, and the chaos collapsed into silence again. "Anyone who reaches for a weapon tonight," he said evenly, "will not see morning." No one moved. He stepped closer to Marco, looking down at him with something like disappointment. "That man said no to protect his daughter," Don Salvatore said. "That makes him braver than you will ever be." Marco shook his head frantically. "Salvatore, please. We can fix this. Money, territory, whatever you want." Don Salvatore crouched, bringing his face close enough that Marco could smell his cologne, could see his reflection in eyes that had ordered deaths without losing sleep. "I don't want anything from you," he said softly. "I want you to understand something before this ends." He stood and turned away. "Men like you think fear is power, but fear without restraint is just noise. And noise attracts attention." He paused at the door. "Tonight, your crew disappears. Not because you challenged me, but because you forgot what lines should never be crossed." As Don Salvatore walked out, the first gunshot rang out behind him, sharp and final, followed by others in controlled succession, each one sealing a decision that had been made the moment a little girl ran barefoot into the village square, and by the time the river swallowed the warehouse lights again, the Bracco name had already begun its quiet erasure, while miles away, a child slept for the first time without fear, unaware that her plea had rewritten the balance of power in a world she would never fully see. By morning, the village woke to a different kind of silence, the kind that followed storms no one dared describe out loud. And although no official announcements were made and no bodies were ever found, everyone understood what had happened because power always left fingerprints even when it tried to clean up after itself. The Bracco name stopped being spoken first in whispers, and then not at all. Their warehouses locked and abandoned, their men gone as if the earth itself had swallowed them. And when people passed the old oak tree, they no longer looked at it with dread, but with something closer to reverence, because it marked the place where fear had been challenged and lost. The carpenter recovered slowly, waking in a clean bed with bandages around his neck and the smell of antiseptic instead of rope, his daughter asleep in a chair beside him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his, as if daring the world to try again. And when he asked where he was, the nurse simply told him he was safe now, that some debts were never meant to be repaid. Don Salvatore never visited the hospital again. He didn't need to. Protection, in his world, worked best when it felt invisible, and instead, quiet changes unfolded over the following weeks. The carpenter's workshop was rebuilt after an anonymous donation covered the cost, Customers returned in numbers he'd never seen before, and no one ever again suggested he store things that didn't belong to wood and honest labor. Every few months, a black car passed slowly through the village without stopping, a reminder rather than a threat, and inside it, Don Salvatore would glance toward the fields where the oak stood, remembering the weight of a child's hands clutching his coat, and the word no spoken with more courage than most men found in a lifetime. The girl kept the silver coin close, rubbing it between her fingers when she felt afraid, though fear visited her less often now, replaced by a quiet confidence that confused her teachers and worried her neighbors, because children were not supposed to learn so early that even monsters followed rules. Years later, when she was grown and the world had changed again, she would tell the story carefully, never naming names, only saying that once, when her father was taken and no one else would help, she ran to the most dangerous man she could find and discovered that power, when bound by principle, could protect as fiercely as it could destroy. Don Salvatore Rizzo continued ruling his territory with the same iron calm, but those closest to him noticed a subtle shift after that night, a line drawn deeper than before, because violence remained a tool, but never again was it used to frighten a child, and in a world built on fear, that became his unspoken law. The oak tree still stands, older now, scarred by time, its branches heavy with memory, and when the wind moves through its leaves, the villagers say it sounds like a warning and a promise all at once, that there are lines even the darkest men will not cross, and that sometimes the bravest thing in the world is a small voice daring to beg when silence would have been safer.